The relentless march of the modern mechanized military machine is often mistaken for a testament to human will or technological superiority.
Yet, beneath the veneer of sweeping offensives and grand strategy lies a far more fragile, terrestrial reality: the absolute dependence on the logistical chain. For the Axis powers, particularly the German Wehrmacht, whose operational doctrine prioritized speed, depth, and the relentless offensive, this umbilical cord of sustenance, the steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and rations, was tethered to fragile networks. When these networks frayed, buckled, or were severed entirely, the resulting collapse was not merely a setback, but an irreversible, definitive turning point in the Second World War.
Our examination begins in the sun-baked expanse of North Africa, a theater defined by vast distances and scarce resources,
where the war effort of the Afrika Korps was intrinsically linked to maritime fate.
The spring of 1943 found Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's formidable panzer divisions, though still capable of sharp tactical strikes,
increasingly crippled by strategic malnutrition during the long, arduous Tunisian campaign. The logistical lifeline for these desert forces stretched precariously across the Sicilian Channel,
a narrow, unforgiving corridor of turquoise Mediterranean waters linking the ports of Italy to the meager docks of Tunis and Bizerte. Allied air superiority, operating from newly secured bases in Malta and North Africa, utterly choked these shipping lanes.
This was not a sudden, dramatic battle, but a systematic, attritional slaughter conducted day and night.
The sea surface, usually shimmering under the relentless desert sun, became perpetually marred by slicks of heavy black oil and floating debris.
Descriptive of this failure are the burning hulks of supply vessels, the essential tankers carrying the precious 87-octane fuel, and the freighters laden with crates of ammunition and dried rations. These ships, targeted by concentrated Allied strikes, often by low-flying Beaufighters or high-altitude B-17s, would catch fire quickly, the thin steel plating of their hulls glowing a painful molten red as they listed violently and slipped beneath the waves. The resulting scene in the ports of disembarkation was one of paralyzing inertia. Rommel's panzer divisions, designed for lightning thrusts and relentless movement, were reduced to static, silent metal beasts. The roar of the Maybach engine, the signature sound of a functioning armored division, was replaced by a frustrating silence, broken only by the rasping whispers of the desert wind.
A Tiger tank, a terrifying weapon system, became nothing more than 1,000 tons of extremely heavy steel plating awaiting a non-existent fuel supply.
The smell of spilled diesel and gunpowder faded, replaced by the acrid scent of ozone, and the fine, pervasive grit of the Sahara that coated everything: faces, uniforms, and the useless dials of the immobilized vehicles. Ammunition shortages meant that when the tanks were forced into defensive, static positions, they could only respond to probing attacks with frustrating restraint, reserving the few remaining high-explosive rounds for threats deemed existential. The collapse here was defined by an emptiness: empty fuel tanks, empty shell casings, and the empty promises of renewed supplies that never breached the Allied blockade. This logistical strangulation sealed the fate of over 250,000 Axis soldiers, leading directly to the final, necessary surrender in North Africa. A stark and horrific contrast to the sun-baked failure of the Mediterranean was presented by the Eastern Front, specifically the cataclysmic encirclement at Stalingrad between late 1942 and early 1943. Here, the challenge was not distance over water, but the sheer, paralyzing vastness and the brutal climate of the Russian steppe. Following the Soviet Operation Uranus, the entire German Sixth Army, approximately 250,000 men, found itself trapped.
within a hastily formed defensive perimeter known internally as the Kessel or cauldron. Hitler, in an act of ruinous strategic stubbornness, forbade any breakout attempt, insisting that the army be supplied entirely by air. The air bridge, intended to deliver a minimum of 700 tons of supplies daily, failed spectacularly from its inception. The logistical collapse was instantaneous and brutal, defined by the relentless grip of the Russian winter. The temperature plunged far below freezing, often hovering around -30 degrees Celsius. The air, crisp and sharp, seemed to steal the heat directly from the lungs. The vast frozen steppe, covered in a blinding, wind-swept snow, became a killing field, characterized by desperate, unending hunger. The Luftwaffe's few available transport planes, struggling against catastrophic weather, Soviet fighter interceptions, and inadequate frozen runways, delivered a mere fraction, sometimes less than 10% of the required provisions. A plane that managed to land might bring only a few dozen tons, yet the priority was often misplaced or simply useless in the context of survival. One famous incident saw an aircraft deliver a massive consignment of pepper and prophylactic items. Essential for a long campaign, perhaps, but entirely irrelevant to men dying of exposure and starvation. The sensory details within the Kessel were overwhelming. The trapped soldiers of the 6th Army quickly devolved from proud fighting men into shivering skeletons. Their thin uniforms, designed for a summer campaign that had disastrously extended into the depths of winter, offered no protection against the howling Siberian wind. The wind carried the sounds of desperate, starved men, the hacking coughs of pneumonia, the low moans of those suffering from frozen, gangrenous extremities, and the terrifying crunch of boots treading on frozen human waste and bodies. Fuel for warmth was non-existent. Trucks were meticulously disassembled for firewood, or abandoned entirely. The logistics chain, meant to sustain the army, instead delivered death by proxy. Rations were slashed to microscopic levels, a few ounces of stale bread, perhaps a sliver of horse meat if they were lucky, and often nothing at all for days. The texture of survival was rough and sharp, frozen metal that instantly stuck to bare skin. The crust of ice covering the meager food, and the hard, cold earth of the foxholes. The collapse here was absolute, turning the army into a static monument of starvation and freezing impotence, sealing one of the greatest strategic disasters in German military history. The relentless fighting that followed the invasion of Italy in the summer of 1943 revealed the third critical logistical collapse, one defined by interdiction and the insurmountable challenge of terrain. Italy was geographically unforgiving. A jagged spine of mountains running down the peninsula provided natural defensive lines. Most famously, the Gustav Line, which centered around the formidable peaks of the Apennines. To hold this line, the German defenders needed a constant, massive influx of heavy artillery shells, fuel, and replacement armored vehicles. Allied air power, having mastered the lessons learned in North Africa, systematically targeted not the frontline units, which were dug deep into the rock, but the circulatory system that fed them, the fragile Italian rail network. Operation Strangle and subsequent interdiction campaigns turned the entire logistical rear of the peninsula into a perpetual target range. The tactics were devastatingly simple and ceaseless. Allied medium and heavy bombers focused their attention on choke points. The vulnerable targets were the crucial mountain tunnels and the high viaducts that spanned the deep ravines. The results were spectacular and terrifying from the ground perspective. A crucial mountain tunnel, the gateway through an otherwise impenetrable ridge, would be turned into a mound of pulverized stone and twisted steel. Bombing runs were so frequent and so precise that engineers could not keep pace with the destruction. As one section of track was repaired, 3 others would be simultaneously destroyed. The sensory atmosphere in the rear areas was one of perpetual noise and dust. The deep, guttural thrum of incoming bombing raids became the soundtrack of the Italian campaign. The air was thick with the smell of concrete dust and high explosives. The texture of the ground was often a confusing, dangerous mixture of broken pavement, uprooted timber, and sharp shards of shrapnel. The impact on the fighting units was immediate and dire. Denial of rail transport meant that supply had to revert to the agonizingly slow and resource-intensive method of truck transport. Over bomb-cratered, winding mountain roads, fuel consumption skyrocketed and movement slowed to a crawl. Most crucially, frontline units were denied the heavy artillery shells required to properly engage the relentless Allied pressure. Holding the Gustav Line required sustained, massive counter-battery fire. When the supply of 150mm and 210mm shells dried up, the remote valley floor, now an inferno of twisted metal, marked the catastrophic scale of the destruction. Thick, dark smoke climbed into the darkening sky, signaling the end of the line. Machine guns and rifles, though plentiful, could not stop a coordinated armored assault backed by Allied naval and aerial bombardment. The collapse in Italy was a slow, systemic weakening, achieved not by confronting the enemy directly, but by starving the machine of the mass and tonnage it required to effectively fight a modern defensive war in a hostile environment. The summer offensive of 1944 witnessed the most rapid and devastating logistical collapse of the war. The destruction of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front during Operation Bagration. This massive Soviet offensive, launched just weeks after the Normandy landings, was a masterwork of deception, speed, and mechanized power that fundamentally shattered the German presence in the East. The Wehrmacht's logistical doctrine relied heavily on holding key railheads and utilizing main roads. Bagration's brilliance lay in bypassing these strongpoints entirely. Soviet mechanized columns, composed of tank armies and assault infantry, ignored the traditional supply routes and, utilizing the relative dryness of the summer ground, rolled swiftly over makeshift dirt roads, through forests and across fields. Their goal was not to destroy the front line, it was to overwhelm the German rear. The speed of the Soviet advance was the direct agent of the German logistical paralysis. Staff officers, depot commanders, and communication units found themselves not 20 miles behind the front, but 20 miles behind the advancing Soviet columns, often without warning. The logistical spine of Army Group Center, the vast network of repair shops, fuel depots, communication centers, and field hospitals, simply vaporized under the pressure. The immediate consequence was uncontrolled logistical panic. Fuel and ammunition dumps, established meticulously over years, suddenly became impossible to defend or salvage. They had to be denied to the rapidly approaching enemy. Abandoned supply dumps burned fiercely, uncontrolled pyres illuminating the collapsing logistical spine of the Army Group. The massive, billowing smoke columns could be seen for miles across the flat Belarusian landscape, a signal flare announcing the total loss of control. The scent of burning rubber, high-octane aviation fuel, and cordite hung heavy in the atmosphere for weeks, a tangible smell of defeat. The chaos of the retreat was defined by noise and dust. Vehicles, desperately trying to move forward to the front or backward to safety, clogged the remaining roads. Drivers, often untrained replacement personnel, abandoned trucks and staff cars in shallow mud bogs or after running out of the last drops of fuel. The remaining German forces found themselves fighting the advancing Soviets using ammunition scrounged from disabled vehicles. With no hope of resupply, reinforcement, or evacuation of the wounded. The Soviet goal was deep operational penetration, and the result was catastrophic encirclement. The entire strategic depth that protected the German supply apparatus was eradicated in weeks. The collapse of logistics is not always due to enemy interdiction far away, but can be triggered by the simple, devastating speed of a coordinated breakthrough that turns the rear into the new front. Finally, the catastrophe of the Falaise Pocket in Normandy offered the definitive visual representation of logistical collapse. Not through slow strangulation or rapid breakthrough, but through sheer, overwhelming saturation and destruction within a defined, narrow space. Following the breakout success of Operation Cobra in late July 1944, the bulk of the German forces in Normandy found themselves increasingly squeezed. The 5th Panzer Army and the 7th Army were trapped in a tightening noose by Allied forces pushing south and east. The only remaining escape route was a narrow, constricted corridor between the towns of Argentan and Falaise. This area soon became known as the Falaise Gap or Pocket. This corridor, barely wider than a few kilometers at its narrowest point, was immediately targeted. It was targeted by every available Allied artillery piece and fighter bomber squadron. The intention was simple: to turn the escape route into an impassable, murderous choke point, destroying everything that moved. The logistical arteries, already weak from relentless attrition fighting, burst completely here. Supply trucks attempting to bring fuel and ammunition into the collapsing pocket were instantly vaporized or disabled. Conversely, the vast columns of retreating German troops, desperate to save themselves and their equipment, jammed the roads into an impenetrable mass. The physical description of the Falaise Pocket is perhaps the most visceral record of logistical annihilation in the war. The narrow, mud-choked corridor was littered not merely with wreckage, but with the mangled, scorching debris of thousands of vehicles stacked upon one another. The ground became a slurry of pulverized earth, oil, mud, and human remains. The sight was horrific: overturned Panther tanks, their massive turrets resting upside down. Flattened Kubelwagen staff cars reduced to sheets of crumpled metal, and thousands of burnt-out half-tracks and trucks, all fused together in a catastrophic, fiery logjam. The atmosphere was thick and oily, dominated by the smell of burnt rubber, diesel. A sweet, cloying stench of decaying flesh lay everywhere, trapped beneath the wreckage or lying exposed in the open fields. The texture of the ground was treacherous, slick with oil and water, littered with hot shrapnel, and uneven. This was due to the constant churn of heavy treads trying to climb over the remains of their fallen comrades' vehicles. The total volume of destruction was staggering. Estimates suggest over 10,000 vehicles were lost within this small radius. This created an obstacle so dense that even the retreating soldiers had to abandon their equipment. They had to scramble over the metal graveyard on foot, leaving behind their entire logistical apparatus. The supply chain didn't just fail, it became the weapon used against the soldiers themselves. This sealed the fate of the remaining divisions in France and marked the definitive end of the German effort to hold the Western Front. These 5 moments are historical testimonies to a fundamental truth of mechanized warfare. The burning hulks sinking in the Mediterranean, the silent, frozen guns of Stalingrad, and the pulverized rail tunnels of Italy. The uncontrolled pyres of Bagration, and the mangled graveyard of the Falaise Pocket. The sustenance of the modern army is a matter of continuous, precise input of resources. The Axis powers, driven by grand strategic visions and dependent on exploiting conquered territories, fundamentally failed to secure this basic prerequisite. Whether the failure was caused by Allied naval and air dominance, as in Tunisia and Italy, or the underestimation of climate and distance, as at Stalingrad, or the overwhelming speed of mechanized defense, as in Bagration.
Or the sheer, concentrated destructiveness of a trapped retreat, as at Falaise. The outcome was always the same.
Logistical collapse proved to be the invisible yet absolute force multiplier for the Allied victory. It transformed magnificent armies into immobile, starving, and ultimately defeated monuments of obsolete ambition. The noise of battle may have grabbed the headlines, but it was the silence of the empty fuel tanks that truly sealed their fate.